And we speak now to Irfaan Mangera, head of Civic Alliance at Rise Mzansi. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. Just listening to one of those interviewed by my colleague there, saying that one of the reasons that Rise Mzansi appeals to him is because it's a movement and not so much a political party. For someone who obviously doesn't understand the distinction, it might be too much of an academic conversation. So how do you break it down to the ordinary man on the street and say, this is how we are different?
Thank you so much, and thanks for playing those clips. It's quite exciting to hear that, because the feedback we've been having consistently from the ground, and why Rise is different, is because Rise is made up of ordinary citizens who believe that this country needs to change, that we need a reset in democracy, particularly young people who think that we have not tasted the fruits of the promise of freedom that 1994 brought us. And so we need to ensure that we use our collective ability, our collective skill and education to drive a South Africa that really exists to serve its people and to serve it well, so that we achieve the dignity and the equality that we had so hoped and desired for. So, I mean, I'd attribute it to Rise Mzansi being a people-driven movement, as you heard Songezo speak, with the kind of culture that the UDF imbibed of an active citizenry, a citizenry that equally believes that they have a stake in this democracy, that they have a stake in the lives of their communities. No one should be sitting frustrated, not knowing what to do. There's enough work for us to do, and Rise has been consistent in saying each of us need to rise up to this occasion and take action ourselves. We can't wait for action to happen. It has to be led from ourselves and our communities that we reside in.
Just watching the UDM's leader earlier on their 26th anniversary, speaking about the need to unite the opposition. And Songezo Zibi himself was critical earlier on of the DA's Moonshot Pact, saying that the problem with it is it's anti-ANC. So I'm just trying to understand also, if I'm your potential voter, for instance, how you say, again, you are a cut above the rest as a democratic alternative, when we can see that multi-party democracy in South Africa is growing, but ultimately also splitting the vote.
It's an interesting point. I don't think it's splitting the vote. I think people follow people, and there's a reason why there's more parties on the block, is primarily because this political system that we're in has not allowed that for people to have a voice and a stake in how things are governed. So when 1994 came, we said, yes, the people must govern, but we didn't ask how should they govern? How should we actually implement a system that allows greater accountability, greater participation, so people have a stake in it? I mean, today we sit and we ask, how many people in a room understand and know who your MP or MPL is? Very few lift up their hand, and yet constituency offices exist in most parts of this country. So I hear the point about what's the difference, and I agree. I think we can't go into coalition talks without having principles and values outlining who we are and what we stand for. What we're seeing currently in the city of Johannesburg, across Tshwane, and many other municipalities, where there's this coalition that has emerged out of position and out of the idea that we're fighting for a piece of the pie, not for what are the common political programs that we all agree to and that we can execute collectively, because that shapes the conversation very differently. It says to parties and the people really who matter most, that the program of, for example, what is our views on housing? What is our views on the economy? What is our views on education? And is there commonality, or if there's some commonality that we can attribute to one another? Currently, it's all about who gets what position and what piece of the pie. And that, I think, is what's causing this grave problem in our democracy in coalition governments. I do think we're at a moment in our country's history where it's maturing to a degree where we're going to have to deal with this more and more. In fact, potentially next year, potentially in 2026, and even more so by 2029. But we need to ensure that people's voice in this, it remains front and center. And therefore, the reforms that are necessary that go with ensuring greater accountability on public officials, greater engagement from the public on how bills are passed, how budgets are passed. And that, I think, will allow us to determine how do we coalesce together. And this might not even be the case just simply for political parties, but for how we relate to broader society. We've been speaking about the 40th anniversary of the UDF. That moment showcased that it was possible for labor and student organizations and women's groups and civic bodies and sports teams to actually come together and say, collectively, we agree that maybe 5 things are a big problem. And we may not agree about the other 10 things, but these 5 things are what we can agree on and what we can go into our communities, go in our constituencies and fight for. And therefore created a mass movement for change that really built a collective vision on what kind of society we want. And I'm afraid this Moonshot Pact doesn't allow us to do that. It's basically a collection of people saying that the ANC must go out and it's our time. I don't think that is sufficient for us at Rise Mzansi.
So over the years, some political pundits have said there isn't much of a difference in what political parties offer. You speak about political reform in their manifestos. And at the moment, the mood in South Africa really is one of frustration by the electorate, particularly in terms of the high levels of corruption, lack of jobs, a slow growing economy. But the point I'm making essentially is that the issues are the same. But we've also seen in the past the sentimentality votes where people say, well, better the devil I know. So how will you circumvent that?
You know, one of my primary drivers of taking up politics quite seriously, and I perhaps for your viewers, I've worked in civil society now for 15 years, across youth development, sports, aid, etc. And we've constantly seen that one of the biggest challenges we have is the crisis of leadership, not on whether we don't have or have the solutions. We've seen multiple research reports being done, commissions after commissions. All of that have been happening. But one of the primary crises is the crisis of leadership. I, for one, last year reached a point where I found myself as a young person, as a 26-year-old last year, saying, I don't want to go to a ballot box next year and cast a vote on that basis, on better the devil you know. I don't think that's as far as aspiration that we have to deal with as a country. We have to tolerate as a country. We as people should be able to say, who is the best amongst us to lead, and how do we get them to go and lead? How do we ensure that the people who we think have the right credibility, the right gravitas, are the ones who are put in the positions of power to manage the affairs of the state and to actually execute this mandate that we had envisioned in 1994. Almost 30 years down the line, I don't think collectively we are engaging in that process. And so we're trying to reshape the way we do politics, and the underlying that is a political culture that needs to be changed. It can't be the loudest mouth or the person who's the most popular in society. That isn't going to cut it. We need to ensure that we have a balance of the most credible, capable leaders, coupled with those who are engaged in active community building, active change work that really brings about people towards a political potential outcome. One of those things, as I've mentioned, is, if we had to ask the gift of the givers to stand for an election, the likelihood is that people will back them because of the track record they have. And this is the kind of thinking and application we need to get to, that we can't be choosing the worst amongst us or tolerate the devil we know. We should actually look for the angels amongst us to say, we need to make sure they are politically engaged and they have the support as a nation to actually go and lead us. And I think that's going to be an important shift. The political culture as well that is coupled with this speaks about the attitudes we have towards politics. It shouldn't be the case that 14 million young people are not engaging in democracy and participating in elections. I think for a big portion of our responsibility as institutions, as community builders, as activists and politicians alike, is to ask ourselves, what do we do to make sure that more voices constantly engage in this process? As he said, democracy is a group project. It's a team sport. We can't leave it to politicians alone to decide. If we're thinking about the rugby, this is a full-on rugby squad and all parts matter. We can't be leaving one part only to the business folk, one part only to the religious groups. All of us have that role, and if we're not constantly engaged in this day-to-day, we then create the crisis and we allow it to continue and reproduce. I raised the stat about young people specifically because as a young person, I think next year is a moment for us to say, who do we want to be leading and how are we going to actively make that happen? I think the time of a protest vote or non-vote is not sufficient anymore.
Irfaan Mangera, thank you so much for your time. He's the head of Civic Alliance at Rise Mzansi.